Alright, and welcome back to the adventures of the monk and the monarch. Today we have me, the monarch, and our local monk, Mildra.
Hello.
So, today when we get into our actual topic, we're going to be discussing the general works of Hayao Miyazaki of Studio Ghibli. And of course, probably a little bit of the stuff he did before Ghibli. As normal, for now what we'll do is get into what anime we've been watching this past month.
One thing that I will note is that I am going to be cheating a bit because I'm going to be bringing up something live action instead of something animated. And that is an old project known as Shibuya 15.
This is my first time hearing about this one.
Shibuya 15 is a weird beast that's leaning into certain aspects of science fiction, especially the idea of simulated reality. The one problem that I do have is that it's clear that the story wants to do this unfolding mystery about. It looks like regular Shibuya, but gradually things seem wrong. The problem is the opening crawl spoils it a bit.
Oh god, I hate it when it does that.
It kind of reminded me of the theatrical cut. In that regard, it reminded me of the theatrical cut of Dark City, where one of the characters just explains the some of the background that you're supposed to be getting through layers. And it does this during the opening credits. Apparently, it had to do with the fact that the film tested poorly, so the studio asked for a last second pivot. And if I'm being honest, I think the way a lot of films do testing and screening is wrong. Mostly because the sample size they use is way too small, and I think they're asking the wrong questions. As somebody who's experimented with some of that testing in other matters, say you get 100 people for a test, and just one test, that's not enough.
Nowhere close to enough.
No. Am I saying that you need to get people in the thousands for testing? Yes, I am. Possibly in the millions, or at least tens of thousands if you can get away with it. Like people love statistics, but I think a lot of times when it comes to examining a work, a lot of people look at the wrong statistics. So I don't do a scoring rating when I do my reviews, and I'm not a fan of scoring ratings on aggregates because there's details that you're not going to get.
Yeah, I've long since abandoned scoring ratings myself. Like, I understand it can be kind of useful for something like Rotten Tomatoes, but
I use a tier system instead. That way, I don't have to rack my brain figuring out what the difference between a 6 or a 7 is. Also, you don't have to deal with the average. But if it didn't have that, then I think I can't help but wonder if things would have been better if that part got skipped. Though the one shining moment in the whole thing is living meme Mark Musashi showing up as one of the villains, Peace, who, even though he speaks very fluent Japanese, he's intentionally speaking wrong.
That sounds fantastic.
It sounds fantastic, and I know that is not easy to do.
Not quite on the same topic, but it's kind of like, what was the movie? It was one of those old David Bowie movies, The Man Who Fell to Earth, where like Bowie is intentionally singing badly, yet successfully sounding like someone who can't sing. Which, from my understanding, is a very difficult thing to pull off if you actually know what you're doing.
Yeah, what I mean by him speaking Japanese wrong is that he can speak Japanese without sounding like too much of an American accent, or like what would happen if you or I tried to speak Japanese, but he's intentionally leaning into that. I think it's meant to add to the not rightness of the thing.
It's one of those things, it might be kind of hard to gauge, though, if you don't actually speak Japanese yourself, how well he did at that.
Well, the subtitle gives him a different font. Everybody else has a fairly normal font that looks kind of like Times New Roman, and he's got a completely different font when he talks.
I mean, that's one way to get the point across.
But because of his delivery, you don't really need to be fluent in Japanese to know that something's off.
I might have to check this out eventually. Because just for that, this sounds interesting.
Yeah, this came out in the early 2000s, so there's going to be some datedness going on with some of the tech, including certain signs in Shibuya that are no longer there. But anybody who's played The World Ends with You will be in somewhat familiar territory, somewhat, which more people should play anyways. Something else that I've been keeping an eye on would be a little film called The Spine of Night, which if someone wants to be on the purist sense, doesn't count as anime, but I've um I've gotten the stick out of my ass regarding this whole narrative of counting anime as this separate ghettoized thing when it's just another medium of animation.
Decided to actually look up some images of Spine of Night real quick, and I don't know much about it, but I kind of
The
like this
Spine
art
of Night
style.
was a. I found out about this late, but it was a sword and sorcery animation project that a lot of people missed out on because it was exclusively on Shutter, and
Yeah, I'm really liking this art style.
it it is very reminiscent of the weird fiction you would see in Weird Tales back in the day, and I can see why it would be grabbed by Shutter. And some of the key art is absolutely astounding. It does not want to be a pretty film, but it is definitely a film whose visual identity you're not going to forget. And of course, the other thing is that it's a rotoscope project, which you barely hear a whole lot of people talking about rotoscoping.
Like the closest thing I'd compare this to, just at this first glance, is the old Song of Fire and Ice animation that came out a long time ago.
Yeah, the one that had collaboration with the legendary Frank Frazetta. I think that's kind of what they were aiming for. I know that it's blasphemous for me to bring up a Western production in an anime centric podcast, but well, for one, we never advertised it as an anime centric podcast, and two, I'm a fan of animation as a medium as a whole, and this falls right into my wheelhouse of looking for hidden treasures.
I'm gonna try to make it a point to sit down and watch this before our next podcast. I'm liking the
Yeah,
look.
it's on Shutter, but worst comes to worst, you might have to sail the high seas. Well, Shutter is a streaming service that is exclusively all about horror.
I've never really been a big horror guy, but sometimes something looks good and catches my eye.
Hmm.
As for me, one of the first things I've watched since the last show we did, I think may end up being my favorite show that comes out this year. That's Rust Eater Bisco. I'm going to give a little bit of credit to comic book resources because I happen to see their description of this show, and I normally don't like the stuff they do, but they described it as a weird cross between Trigun and Dorhedoro. That's kind of accurate. It's like the kind of post-apocalyptic world setting where most of these worlds are desert, but there's this disease going around called rusting, where it's basically like causing people to rust. A lot of the blame gets put on a group of people called the Mushroom Keepers. And then shit just starts getting crazy. Like, at one point watching this show, I just had to out loud say to myself, did she just throw a fucking gorilla into a hippo? That that's the kind of show this is. But
Yeah, and it is. It's. I'm trying to see who did the animation.
I don't remember the studio.
And it just gives me the director and the publication of the manga version. Oh, by Oz.
I don't have a whole lot of knowledge of a lot of different animation studios. I know like Studio Bones, Madhouse. I'm not familiar with Oz. They a newer one?
Well, it looks like because they don't have a wiki page.
Well, this is a new studio. Congratulations to these guys because it looks fantastic, just opening to end.
So I okay. I have to slightly take it back. They're not. They are a newish studio, but they've been around for a while. But they've in fact quite a while. But it's been in second unit stuff like painting or finishing animation or doing paint checks or being a support studio. A whole lot of finish animation on a lot of major projects. Um,
So this might
they
actually be their first like outing as a full project then, rather than just playing second fiddle to somebody else.
Yeah, unless there's another Studio Oz that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, like, one other thing I think I'd probably draw a comparison to is just because of how the last 4 or 5 episodes are set up. It almost pulls like a Gurren Lagann where just suddenly everything just starts ramping up at a very rapid rate at the end. Like, the whole finale is like the entirety of the last 4 or 5 episodes. It just starts and it just carries itself on pure momentum and emotion for 5 straight episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Just really great action. I love every character that has shown up in this show, like, without exception. The entire cast is great. But it's one of those moments where the more you think about what actually happens during the end, the more it kind of starts to break down logically. Like, you're wondering why certain people are doing certain things or acting in a certain way. So it kind of depends. Are you going to get hooked onto the emotions and momentum by that point to where that's not going to bother you?
Mm-hmm.
If you don't get as hooked as I did on it, I can see that ending completely falling apart. That said, I loved it. Kind of sad more people weren't talking about this one.
Well, that's the reason why we do what we do.
Yeah.
But there will always be those hidden gems out there, and part of the fun is discovering them. I don't need 10 or 10,000 people to validate whether or not something I find is good.
Oh, I'm right with you there. I do still wish more people could watch some of this stuff, but yeah, I'm gonna love it regardless. Really excited for a second season to come out.
Has there been confirmation that a second season will?
I don't think so. Like, I finished it shortly after it completely aired, I believe, and I haven't looked up any news on it recently.
Although, quick aside, you have no idea how much I'm feeling regarding both Berserk and Vinland Saga making their return.
You know, I'm a little worried about Vinland Saga because I really liked that first season, but I realized the thing I was most excited for in all of Vinland Saga was Askeladd's story. Now, I won't spoil it for anyone who's not seen Vinland Saga, but that's kind of done now. So I'm looking at everything else they have set up and like, I don't know if I find it that interesting.
There will be some shifts later on because I have read through a lot of the manga. Something that's important to note is Vinland Saga is somewhat based on the story of Eric the Red, and what's more important about that is it playing a factor in the creation of Vinland, which is the reason why people say that the Vikings discovered America years before Columbus did, which is technically true. The area that was known as Vinland for 100 years and change is in what's now known as Newfoundland.
Yeah, as far as Berserk's concerned, weird confession, apparently I've never actually watched or read Berserk. For years, I was thinking like, yeah, I saw it, I couldn't really get into it. This past year, I started to realize, I've never seen this. What have I been thinking Berserk was for this past decade? I don't know. So I'm gonna have to sit down and start reading this now that it's going to finish.
If you need a summary you could always look at the long videos that the almighty Loli has done.
In the time I could watch those videos, I'm pretty sure I could just read a bunch of Berserk.
Fair.
It's like, I don't know what this weird recent trend is of people doing like essays of movies that last longer than the fucking movie. But that's an entirely weird, different rant.
I've seen some people who do video essays on movies and shows, but they're not that long. I watch a lot of Phil Mento's video essays, and they're usually less than 20 minutes.
See, that's fine. That's good. 2 hours discussing why a 1 hour movie isn't very good. Not so much.
If you're talking about every frame of pause, that's a special case. Yeah,
I'm not familiar with that one. So that could be a different case right there.
Well, that's more of a podcast. Of course, the Parliament of Geeks show that I have on occasion is certainly lengthy, but a lot of times it's us discussing in detail.
So, what else have you been watching this past month?
I have mentioned before that I am a fan, I guess, of the works of Masaki Yuasa. and I decided to look back at one particular entry of his that I had not finished. That being Kaiba. Like I saw a couple episodes and then I got caught up in some other projects, so I didn't finish. This is going to be a moot point because of Yuasa's track record, but Kaiba is weird. You have this Dr. Seuss like landscape focused on a story where people exchange memories the way you would exchange cash. And then things get weird. If it sounds like I'm tiptoeing around it, it's because I'm trying to figure out what I could say about it without spoiling. A lot of Yuasa's stuff, just telling the story doesn't convey the whole picture. Like if I told you the story of Tatami Galaxy of somebody trying over and over to find his raven-haired maiden, you'd think it'd be boring. It's how he tells the story that's where the interesting stuff comes in. That and the fact that I hope to God Yuasa's not on drugs. And if you need a more contemporary example of his interesting animation styles, he was the guy behind Devilman Crybaby.
I looked up Kaiba and I don't know what to think of this just from looking at stills, but I'm interested.
Like I said, it's weird.
Yeah, there's some shows that are just really hard to talk about like that, I guess. See, one of the other things that I've been watching, just because I'm heading to Anime Matsuri this year, and I was gonna go down there as Kenshin Himura from Rurouni Kenshin, so I'm like, I'll start rewatching the old Rurouni Kenshin anime. It's been so long since I've seen it. Like, on this rewatch, I'm only about 6 episodes in now, I think. And as much as I love this show, I will say there is one problem I've been having with it that I didn't really remember from all those years ago. It can get a little wordy with people explaining how they feel and why they're doing the things they're doing. Like, it's a moment where, like, I get the point. You don't need to keep talking. I don't know if this is just an early episode thing, but it is very noticeable.
Me personally, I look at that as a consequence of the fact that keep something that is important to keep in mind is Rurouni Kenshin is historical fantasy, and a lot of the bigger context with it is related to the politics of what happened post Meiji Restoration.
I think the show does do a good job at getting that across, even if you yourself aren't very familiar with the era or Japanese politics at the time. But I do still think they could have, like, not talked so much. That sounds like a weird thing to say, because I like a lot of shows that involve a lot of talking. But again, it's not something that ruins the show or anything. Like, it's still absolutely fantastic. Mm-hmm. I remember not really liking the little kid. I should remember his name since I watched an episode last night.
Yahiko,
that was it. I was never the biggest fan of him for most of the show. Like, I remember him getting better later on. These early episodes, though, it can be kind of a chore to sit through his spots. That said, I love the kind of Kenshin archetype of the former killer, like, trying to live a more noble life now that the war is over. They do fantastic with that. Like, the episode I left off on is the first time he runs into one of the old manslayers from just the war, the guy with the weird eye effect.
Yeah, Gine,
yes. I am terrible with names. But, yeah, it's like the first, early on in the show, you get the first time where Kenshin's having to struggle with those old tendencies of his. And it's very compelling, and they don't have to spend a lot of episodes building up Gine to do it. Mm-hmm. He comes in at one episode, kidnaps Kaoru. By the end of it, you're already feeling the tension. So yeah, I'm still loving the show despite noticing a few things that I don't quite like about it. So has there been anything else you've been watching, or?
No, but there's one question I do have.
Yeah?
Do you have any plans to watch the OVAs?
Oh, Samurai X?
Yeah.
I wasn't planning to rewatch them lately, but I have watched them in the past. I'm wondering if I'm one of the few people who like the anime more than the OVAs, but I do like them.
I think comparing the two isn't quite fair because they're trying to do different things.
Oh yeah.
Well, except for Reflection. I don't talk about Reflection. Even Watsky doesn't like Reflection.
Wasn't Reflection the one that like has like all the characters from Rurouni Kenshin? It takes place like after the Kosei years.
It tries to be a sequel-ish.
See, I'm thinking back. I know I watched it, but I don't remember anything about it. I don't know if that's a bad thing. Maybe I'm subconsciously blocking something out, but now I'm worried.
Well, you don't pay me enough to be armchair psychologist.
Fair enough. Yeah, a couple other things I've been watching. I'm a few episodes into Spy Family, Spy X Family, Spy Cross Family. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to.
The X is always silent. Same goes with Hunter x Hunter or Gunsword.
What about X, the TV series?
Well, that's not X. It's X 1999.
Okay.
So doesn't count. That's a giant capital X. I'm talking about those little cross style X's.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm a few episodes in. I'm digging it. I don't know how many people are going to agree with this statement, but I think by and large the appeal of this show, it is the perfect amount of stupid. Here's kind of what I'm saying. Like, the very first mission Twilight is on, the greatest the greatest spy of this country is on a mission to protect a dude from getting... He's trying to get pictures of, like, some politician in a toupee, but it's built up as, like, such this epic thing, this grand plan of, like, months of dating some politician's daughter to get to these pictures. It's all over a toupee. But everyone is treating this so deadly seriously. It's hilarious.
I'd say that the appeal is having something for everyone.
I'd say that's also true. There's a lot of different stuff in this show. Like, I'm not trying to boil it down to that's all the show has to offer. But that kind of seems to be a core appeal and the running thing through the show so far. Again, I might be the only one describing it that way.
With that in mind, I will admit that some of the fan art has been at its usual quality. The one gag that I've been enjoying that some fan artists and some memers have been doing is referencing Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
Yeah, I thought of that before I ever saw the memes. I'm like, everyone had to have thought of this. Like, it's so obvious that that's the comparison that would be made.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, the memes have been pretty hilarious on that one.
It doesn't exactly help that because of how certain things are taken seriously. There's plenty of potential. There seems to be this weird thing that when it comes to Western films, it's the bad ones that always get made into meme fodder. Whereas it's the good stuff that gets made into meme fodder. Obviously, that's not a universal thing. Sometimes there's exceptions on both ends. It's just something I find kind of funny.
Yeah, I haven't actually thought about that before. Like, what was it, Morbius? No one really liked it. Then it got memed so hard they tried re-releasing it thinking they could capitalize on it, and it bombed even harder the second time.
May I refer you to Einstein's definition of insanity?
Yes. But yeah, beyond Spy Family, like, I don't have too many thoughts because I think I'm only like 4 or 5 episodes in right now, and show hasn't even finished coming out yet. 2 other things that I've watched. One of them I'll get into last because that'll lead into our topic. The other one, it's the full title to this, The Genius Prince's Guide to Raising a Nation Out of Debt. This is one of those shows that, in part at least, works as a parody to certain anime archetypes, but it's the good kind. The kind that's poking fun at something out of a place of love. This show's kind of making fun of, like, those protagonists that have, like, these super elaborate plans because they're thinking so far ahead of everyone else, predicting people's actions. But when you stop and think, some of these don't take into account one of 2 different human aspects. One of which is sometimes the people you're dealing with are so stupid there's no way you're going to be able to figure out what they're going to do. To kind of put all this into concept, like, the thing that kicks off the first, like, major story arc is he's going back and forth with, like, an old colleague who's trying to force his country to side with her in some kind of weird upcoming rebellion in her country. And it revolves around some guy who's in love with her from her country or whatever. Well, he sends him a letter saying, like, after her visit here, she's going to go over there to declare her love for him. So, you know, just to kind of get him out of that guy showing up here with troops. But when he sees the letter, he's just so excited, he just comes to pay a visit. And as they're trying to figure out what to do, he drunkenly challenges the main character to a duel, falls out of a window, and snaps his own neck. Now there's a country that thinks he knows about the revolution plot, because they just got a letter luring him out to another country, and suddenly he dies in an accident. That's kind of how the flow of the story in this show goes. Like, it's not a very deep show at all, but it's another one. All the characters are great. The premise is pretty funny. And of course, the main character still uses his wit to adjust to, like, these insane situations other people's stupidity puts him in. So yeah, if you want something that's like a good, lighthearted poking of the fun at certain anime tropes like that, it's a good watch. Again, it's not something that requires a whole lot of in-depth discussion either. Unless I'm missing something, which it's possible. Other than that, the only other thing I've really watched of note this past month is it was my first time watching Porco Rosso. I am mad people didn't tell me this movie was this good. All the Miyazaki movies I see people hyping up, this just never seemed to be one of them. It's probably one of my favorites now that I've watched it.
It's definitely one that I can, because there's always been two films under a lot of the banner that I think a lot of people don't talk about as much. Porco Rosso is one of them. The other one I'd say is Whisper of the Heart, which we'll probably talk about both of them in some fashion throughout the night.
Weirdly enough, I didn't even realize he made Whisper of the Heart, and I've never watched that one.
Technically he didn't. His studio did.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, I just looked it up. He did the screenplay for it. Yeah, I won't talk too much about Porco Rosso right now, since we might get into a bit more detail as time goes on, but yeah, I wanted to point out I absolutely love that movie. It's just pure joy beginning to end. So with that, I guess we might as well get into our actual topic, discussing the career of Miyazaki.
Yeah.
Now, we discussed a bit of this beforehand. We won't be like going in detail onto every single one of his movies, in part because that would take so long, and I don't know if anyone wants to sit here for that many hours.
Well, I certainly wouldn't be opposed to sitting in one place for a good amount of time, talking about film. Not everybody is made of the same stock I am.
Yes, well, I guess where shall we start on our discussion of really a long and storied career?
I think one of the best places to start is for me the earliest work that I ever saw him involved with, which was The Castle of Cagliostro. Now,
the one before Studio Ghibli was actually formed.
I will note that the people that would become Studio Ghibli also had some involvement in the original Thundercats. However, Cagliostro is my earliest experience with him, and it's even as a fan of Lupin. We could do a whole episode on Lupin the Third just over the years. The version of Lupin in that one is a bit odd when you compare it to how Lupin tends to act in everything else.
I think there's definitely similarities, but yeah, this is definitely its own kind of unique Lupin in the franchise.
I don't know if it was a case of just a lighter hand on things or what happened, but like I said, it is a unique setup, and a lot of I'd also note that in the early 80s, he was responsible for Sherlock Hound until Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's estate decided to be idiots.
Of course they were.
Basically, he did 6 episodes, and then the estate said, "No, you can't do that." And by the time it got resolved, he was working on other stuff. But in a lot of those breakthrough years, there's a lot of him trying to adapt classical works or things that are loosely inspired by classical works, whether it be Cagliostro, and obviously the legacy of Arsène Lupin. Wow, that's really bad French. Or trying to do a nod to Sherlock Holmes, or trying to do a story based on a Tibetan folktale of all things with The Journey of Shuna, which I haven't seen. I know about, but I haven't seen. Or rather, what am I thinking? It was a graphic novel that he was involved with, which, if I'm being honest, in this particular time, the 70s through the early 80s, I think what you see in this is him trying to develop his visual style. Now that he's no longer working with he wasn't completely independent, but he was working on his own stuff, because in his early days he was with Nippon Animation, then Telecon Animation Film, which is a section of TMS, And TMS, if you're familiar with animation, needs no introduction. But given that you're bad with names, I might have to fill that in.
Possibly. Like, once I start hearing things they're involved with, I'm like, oh, okay, I know who they are.
TMS, Tokyo Movie Shueisha, is one of the more venerated animation studios over the last 50 years. Not just in Japan, but also in the States. When you're dealing with a show that has to have episodes out weekly, you do have to dole out some of the work to other studios. This is not a new practice. Helper studios have been a thing for the longest time, on both sides of the pond. The downside is that sometimes you get different animation styles, but they were responsible for assisting with some of the animation work on Batman TAS, on the original Batman animated series, but as well as Animaniacs and a bunch of other stuff, including Little Nemo. The point is that they've been around a while. So around this time, he had jumped around between being an artist and being an animation director, and this is where you get stuff like Daydream, Data Notes, and eventually Nausicaa, which ran from 82 to 94.
Yeah.
And if I'm being honest, I'd say Nausicaa is the first instance of Miyazaki really developing his particular style.
There's definitely traces of that in Lupin. Like, that's kind of where you see the start of where there's some kind of a flight thing in pretty much all of his movies.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Did you actually go and see the movies in theaters when they were re-released during that whole Ghibli month thing?
No.
All right.
Because the theater that was doing it was way out of my area. It'd be an hour and a half drive each way.
That would be a while. But I lived close to the theater here that was doing it, and it's the nicest theater in town, so that was fantastic. The first thing I want to note I learned is that's actually when I discovered there are 2 different dubs of that movie.
Mm-hmm.
I did not know that at the time.
Yeah, there's the Warriors of the Wind dub of Nausicaa, which
Well, I was meaning Lupin the Third.
Oh,
but
Lupin, sorry. Yeah, there is certainly that.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that was actually really cool about a lot of the Ghibli month premieres is they'd have different people in, like, before the movie itself started, talking about it. In the case of Lupin the Third, it's like the guy who heads Pixar Studios. I don't know if he still does or if it was just at the time, but one of the founding members at Pixar. Like, when he got out of college, he was saying, like, yeah, he'd study Disney animation. Because at the time, Disney was, like, the top tier for any kind of Western-based animation.
I think this was right around the time of the Renaissance.
I believe so. Yeah, said he studied all those techniques, but then he turned around, saw something coming out of Japan, so watched Lupin the Third, Castle of Cagliostro. Despite all of his knowledge, like he said, as he watched it, he couldn't figure out how they did half the things they pulled off in that movie. It was just one of those interesting things to see, like, how much influence even Miyazaki had in the West, even as far as back then. Like, Ghibli hadn't formed yet. He didn't have his, like, deals of publishing his movies through Disney, but his stuff was still getting noticed. It was making an impact on an entirely different nation's industry because of how ahead of the time some of the stuff coming out of his group was.
Yeah, and I would say that the adaptation of Nausicaa is where he really broke out.
Oh yeah, like I will say Cagliostro, that might be my favorite movie of his, but there's a different style that he gets into when he gets to Nausicaa.
Apparently, the inspiration for one of the inspirations for Nausicaa was the poisoning of Minamata Bay, which, if you're curious as far as how that could cause the inspiration, look up that and look up Minamata's disease. And it's worth noting that the first project for Studio Ghibli was Laputa, where you're still kind of seeing that mix of fantastical machinery that we were starting to see in Nausicaa still being present. Not exactly in the same way, but not far off either.
Yeah, like through all of his stuff, or at least most of it, he really seems to like mixing those fantastical elements with rising technology, how those work or go together.
There was also a lot of it. There was There was also a lot of influence in architecture that you'd see in Greece and Europe.
He was
And
very good at mixing a lot of different
yeah,
elements.
but it is important to note that there's a narrative that Miyazaki was the leading frontmanish guy when it came to Studio Ghibli. When it came to the founding of that studio, he was one of three people. Four. Takahata, Tokuma, and Suzuki were also involved in the founding. A lot of it was based on their experiences with Tokuma Shoten, and because of that, a lot of the staffers who worked on Nausicaa went with them, which is pretty standard fare. Somebody breaking out on their own, they want to get the people that they've been able to make money with. There was one bit of chaos because, and I didn't find out about this until I started doing research. My Neighbor Totoro, which I've seen but I won't consider my favorite, and Grave of the Fireflies, which is a good way to make people cry. Those were released right alongside each other because there were some financial issues, and trying to do two films at once for one studio was chaos, especially for the artist because you have to juggle two plates at once. It's kind of funny that a lot of people look so highly on Totoro because it didn't do well in Japan.
Yeah, isn't that one of the weird ones? It just did better stateside.
I don't know how much better it did stateside when it finally came out because of the gap of time, but it's gotten to cult classic status because it was well received by critics and a lot of people who watched it. It's just that not a lot of people watched. I don't know if it was the case of double dipping because well, Laputa was the highest grossing animation project in Japan that year. With one exception, a lot of the early entries are a case of good, but didn't really stick in my mind. Kiki's Delivery Service is one of those cases. Yeah, it did really well, but for some reason it just didn't stick with me.
I think that's kind of the overall feel for that movie because I know I've seen it. I can remember bits and pieces about it, but that's kind of it.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, before we went live, you and I had talked a bit about and we talked a bit about it just a moment ago about Porco Rosso, and what's kind of funny about that one is that's definitely one of my favorites. If only because I have a soft spot for that sort of early aviation culture, and apparently Miyazaki had said at one point that it was foolish of him to try and put that out because mature themes aren't suited for children.
I don't know if I agree with that statement, but
I certainly don't. It's definitely the first case of him putting in anti-war themes.
I don't think that was like a huge part of the movie, but they're definitely there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I know it's a movie I thought had a lot of his it definitely has a lot of typical Miyazaki movie stuff going on with it. Mm-hmm. I also think in a lot of ways it's a lot different than some of his other work.
Apparently the inspiration was the Yugoslav wars in the early 90s.
Yeah.
Which I'm not going to get into because getting into international politics gives me a headache.
Yeah.
But for me, when it comes to this early period, the film of his that has remained one of my favorites is Princess Mononoke.
That is definitely in my top 3. I think that's the first Miyazaki film I ever watched was Mononoke.
For a lot of people, it was their first, especially during that VHS era, and even more so because of how different it was to everything else that people were seeing.
Oh yeah,
that was when he started to break out globally. A lot of that early stuff we had missed out on until access to anime became easier.
Yeah, you didn't really see cartoons here in the West where there's that much blood either. At least not often that got big. You had your heavy metals, but
heavy metal was more of a European institution.
Yeah.
There were the two movies. One of them's better than the other, but it's important to note that heavy metal is not a singular story or a universe. Heavy metal, or Metal Hurlant, as it's known in France, is more akin to an anthology publication. Like 2000 AD or Weird Tales.
Oh yeah.
And it was a place for a lot of writers and artists to do one-offs.
Yeah.
and in one case, is credited as the thing that allowed Mobius to break out.
But yeah, the comparison was more just like that was kind of the biggest cartoon that got really big, like over here in the States, that did have a lot of blood and violence in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is certainly not that kind of violence in Mononoke.
Yeah, but what I do find kind of interesting is this was an early instance of using 3D rendering in animation. The idea is 3D render things like the demon flesh and then composite them, which was certainly a groundbreaking move. Things like the demon flesh, and I think the reason why the 3D rendering isn't noticeable is that they use the 3D rendering as a basis, and then drew over that. I'd liken it to how Doom had physical models of all the monsters and then did a digital overlay of it.
I mean, it came out looking really good. Like, I never would have guessed those demon things were done in a different style than the rest of the show.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it blends together perfectly.
Yeah, but what's kind of funny is that, how I mentioned the relationship they had with Tokuma Shoten. Um, that ended up lasting all the way up until 2005, and really the early 2000s is a point in anime that I have a soft spot for, because this was where a lot of stuff was really breaking out, and it be and it's and the ability to access became far easier with the fact that you had three different companies putting out a variety of stuff pretty regularly. Um, of course, the other thing that certainly helped was, as I mentioned before, the early 2000s was when digital techniques started to enter into animation styles. The DigiPaint thing being one of the big ones, which some people took to it very well, others not so much.
Yeah, you also had anime showing up, like, on a lot of just normal networks. Like, Adult Swim was becoming a thing.
Hmm.
You had Sci-Fi was doing regular animation, just anime nights.
Yeah.
I know it was cropping up on others, but I think those were the two big ones.
Hmm. And in the case of Ghibli, they started to develop their relationship with Miramax Films, and
Yeah.
Miramax was the one who handled the distribution for Mononoke and subsequent stuff, which is how we kind of got the no cuts rumor, which to this day I don't think has been ever confirmed.
Now, what I remember hearing or reading in one of the interviews with Miyazaki, like, I don't know if this was like a real interview, but it seemed legit. It was a while ago. Well, if someone asked him about it, he said, "I did not send the katana. That was my producer." So apparently, someone did in fact send the Miramax the katana with no cuts.
For those who forgot this, there's a rumor that that one of the executives at Miramax wanted to cut, or rather edit the film to be more quote unquote marketable, and they were sent a katana with a note that said no cuts. And I think the whole thing of him saying that his producer did it is a case of admitting it without
Yeah.
actually admitting it.
Point in case, it sounds like an actual katana was sent. Maybe
Hmm.
we don't know who exactly sent it,
Yeah. Um,
but I think the whole
although
point of that story is he did not want his stuff getting altered just to make it more marketable to a new audience.
Yeah, which kind of reminds me of the eternal unicorn that is the wider audience. There is no such thing. Anyone claiming that there is lying to you, or they're delusional, or both.
I think most of it's delusion.
Mhm.
Like, there's some people just straight lying about it, and a lot of people just believed that and
Yeah,
continue to believe it.
but in between the success of Mononoke, you did see him going back to some of his old things, like mixing technology and wanting to do nods to classical fairy tale like literature that he had grown up with, or that inspired him in some way, whether it be an adaptation of Howl's Moving Castle, or rather by Diana Wayne Jones, and and also the Earthsea film that he did. Well, not that he did, but that
His son
his
did.
son Goro did, because at the time Miyazaki was considering retiring. Ursula K. Le Guin wanted Miyazaki himself, wanted Hayao himself to do it, but the thing ended up going through. It's not perfect, but it is. But I will say it is a better adaptation of the Earthsea novels, which is one of the more well regarded fantasy novels. It did a better job than sci-fi did. Low bar, I know, but still there.
I have no idea what happened with the sci-fi version.
They made some significant changes, and Le Guin publicly disowned it.
Oh god, that's bad.
Hmm.
Now, I will say for Earthsea, I see why it's not one of the better regarded Ghibli films, but there's still a lot I liked about it. Like, there's clearly content that was missing from the stories. They did not do a good job condensing all of that down into one movie.
Hmm.
But there's still a charm to it. There's still some good animation and beats to the story. Like,
Yeah,
I think Goro does have some talent.
but
Just the project he was given, I don't think he was quite ready for that.
what I do find kind of funny is from 2000 onward with Spirited Away, which, don't get me wrong, I liked Spirited Away, but this is where you started to see the trend where a lot of the darker tones that he would go with, whether it be anti-war or environmentalism or technology, he started to shift away from that and focus more on fairy tale like stories and romance. There's also the fact that when I look at a lot of the inspirations for some of the films, a lot of it is places out in nature or events outside of Japan, which I think is it certainly helped the global appeal that Miyazaki's work has. But I can't help but wonder if something was lost in the shuffle sometimes. And I'm not saying that Mononoke is one of my favorite of his works because of how dark it is. I'm not some edgelord.
Yeah, definitely.
But rather the reason why it's one of my favorites is largely because of the strength of theme and the understanding of conflict.
I will say, like, in a bit of a broad sense, there are times that Miyazaki can come off a little on the preachy side, but Mononoke really helps that with it doesn't just try to paint like one side of this argument as just like the pure evil villains. Like, Irontown aren't bad people. They're just trying to make their way through life, survive.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just trying to paint the anti-environmental people as these monsters, and it's really not even trying to paint them as anti-environmental.
Yeah,
It really helps because he's humanizing every side of this argument.
but as time went on, he started to it seemed like he wanted to focus more and more on being this fairy tale like approach, and it does make me wonder at times if there's some sort of self consciousness about the times that he's done mature themes, quote unquote.
It could be that. It may also be just you do that for so long, it might start to wear on you.
Except those kind of themes he didn't do that much.
Well, I think environmental themes are a part of a lot of his work, but yeah, I see your point.
Now, when it comes to his opinion on the animation industry,
Anime was a mistake.
yeah, this whole thing about taking, how do I want to put this, that animators don't want to draw real people. I think this is a consequence of that whole looking at nature and events in Europe and other places as inspiration. I think in the process of doing that, he developed a bit of tunnel vision about that kind of thing and not seeing the bigger picture of what inspires other people,
No,
which is a bit ironic.
Oh yeah, but see, when I originally heard it, I didn't hear it as like how people are drawing. It's like how people write characters. The translations I ended up hearing, or at least heard people talking about, was that he was saying people seem to be writing a lot of characters that just don't always feel like people. Like a lot of these writers don't really understand how people work. That's kind of how I've heard people talk about that interview where that whole anime is a mistake thing came from.
Yeah, the problem is that's the reason why I say there's a bit of tunnel vision. And now I think a lot of his issues with technology are a reflection of the fact that he grew up in the Showa era, where there was the rapid amount of progress, especially during the economic bubble in that time. That same push towards technology was what led to the rise of a cyberpunk subculture within Japanese animation and other stories. So this is the reason why I said that there's a bit of tunnel vision, where I can see where he's coming from, but I don't think he sees the bigger picture about what can inspire people to create art. There's this view that the thing that inspires people to create art is very very narrow. You know, essentially this idea that the true form of art is the one that's inspired by nature, or the whole real people thing. I think something that he kind of forgot is animation does not do realism well. This whole idea of observing real people. One, how do you know people don't? Two, if you look at animation throughout the years, animation has focused more on exaggeration. And if I need to use a case in point, just consider the works of Tex Avery, who had the mindset that you should be able to do just about anything with animation. That's the mindset that's become dominant when it comes to animation on both sides of the pond. That's the reason why I understand where he's coming from with his whole real people argument, but I don't think he sees the bigger picture.
One of those things, like, there's definitely a place for people looking at things and making things like Miyazaki did. But there's so much more out there than that. There's so much that doesn't fit into that little view that is absolutely fantastic.
As far as his attitudes on otaku, whenever I see people lament about this kind of thing, what I always find laughable about this is people pretending that this is a new phenomenon.
Yeah, I don't think it matters where in the world you are. The otaku have the stigma.
I'm not saying that there aren't problems with otaku culture. Obviously there's shit in everybody's yard. But I don't think he's criticizing otaku. I think he's criticizing an idea of otaku.
Oh yeah.
Especially since if I really wanted to be a petty motherfucker, which I am, I could say that the amount of the interests that inspire him make him just as guilty. You know, focusing so much on things in Europe. Plus, when it comes to being creative in some form, you have to be a little obsessive. It's just the nature of the beast, especially if you want to put out something that's on some level of quality. And I know some might argue that is bad form of me to criticize somebody more successful than me and my senior. That's not how I operate. I know that people have the whole respect your elders thing, but respect does not equal reverence.
Yeah, like, as much as I love Miyazaki, there's definitely some weird things you can criticize about him in general. I don't think it takes away from any of his work, mind you.
Now, I suppose I should bring up the controversy that happened with The Wind Rises, because that caused a major shitstorm politically.
I completely missed out on all that. Like, I knew something was going on with Wind Rises when it came out, but it's one of those things I looked at for a minute and I'm like, no, I'm done. Just stop caring. So I have very little details about that situation.
Although I also think it was bad form for him to criticize Charlie Hebdo back in the 2000s. But that's getting into politics, and I always feel weird when people outside of a certain country start doing hot takes on politics. I don't like doing hot takes on Japanese politics. I only bring it up when it's necessary, and I certainly don't like the opposite happening. But
oh yeah,
when it came to when it came to the Wind Rises, he got roasted with some people calling him anti-Japanese.
Look, I don't even know what's going on with that controversy, but I'm like, that sounds wrong.
What's kind of funny is that he claimed that condemning war wasn't the film's intention, and yet there's definitely a bit of that.
It's a movie I don't remember too much about either.
It came out in
2013?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've seen it. I just don't remember much about it. For some reason, it wasn't one of his movies that just stuck in my mind. Like, I knew it was the controversy had something to do with, like, a manufacturer of warplanes, if I remember.
Yeah. And in more recent stuff, in one of the more recent films that got announced, which I haven't seen, they started to shift into 3D animation, which, in my opinion, is a massive mistake unless you know exactly what you're doing. And because of how detailed Miyazaki's films can be just from frame to frame, I don't think that's something that you can do very well in 3D.
Let's see. It's How Do You Live, I think, is the name of the next film he's working on.
Yeah, which apparently has had some production issues.
Yeah, announced 2016. I heard nothing about it, so
and still isn't out. Just to use a parallel, when Lupin the First, I know, came out, I was a little bit skeptical about it going 3D, but because of the fact that Lupin has a much simpler style, I think it's able to get away with it.
Yeah, I don't think it's impossible to do it in 3D. It's just I can't imagine that's going to be a cheap process to do something like Miyazaki stuff in 3D.
Well, we saw whenever you have somebody who has a detailed style, they should not be doing 3D. It doesn't work all that well unless you really want to put in the money.
Yeah.
Now look at what happened with look at what happened when you try and do 3D with Berserk back in 2016 and how god awful the animation was.
Yeah, I saw clips of that, and no.
Because Miura has a very detailed art style, and trying to do that in 3D is just setting yourself up for disaster. Hell, even 2D animation has difficulty, and the 90s anime kind of cheated. But apparently, at one point, the film was planned to be released near the time of the Summer Olympics. Obviously, that didn't happen. And I have to correct myself. Earwig and the Witch was the one that was 3D, but that was handled by Goro.
Yeah, that one I didn't see either. I've not really heard anyone talking about that one.
I talked about it briefly when the first trailer came about, and I wasn't all that fond of the thing. And apparently, I'm not the only one, because a lot of critics found it mid.
Yeah, I just looked up the general reception, and that does not seem to be well rated at all. Maybe there's a reason I've never heard anybody talking about it.
Pretty much. But that about as far as what the future is going to hold, I think Goro is going to end up being the heir apparent, but just stay away from CG for a while.
I kind of feel bad for Goro, because it doesn't seem like he's really done much work that most people care too much about.
If I'm being honest, I think part of the problem is standing in his old man's shadow.
That can't really help.
Like, I know some people who will outright go through a name change so they don't have to deal with that problem. A good example of that kind of thing would be, if you'll permit me for making a wrestling reference, Jungle Boy over in AEW. Even though early on he had used his name Jack Perry because he's the son of Luke Perry.
Yeah.
He didn't want that coloring things, and he gets a little bit annoyed when Jim Ross still uses his name.
Yeah, that can be a weird thing to have to play around with, because people are gonna draw the connections whether you change your name or not. The internet's a thing. They're gonna know, even if Jim Ross didn't say anything, that it's the son of Luke Perry. But you also don't want to just lean too hard into that either, or you're just going to look like you're trying to curb off your family's reputation rather than doing it yourself. It can't be a good position to be in. Like, I'm hoping Goro actually does start to fill out his own style, though, because, again, I saw some good stuff there in Earthsea. He's clearly a talented guy. And I'd love to have another successful anime director running around. The more, the better.
Yeah, and until then, we'll just have to keep treasure hunting.
Yeah. Now, I know we're not going to get into specific details on too many movies, but since this is winding a bit down, what actually is your favorite Ghibli film? I know, not the easiest question to answer sometimes, for a variety of reasons.
I hate you. If someone has to put my back against the wall on this particular matter, I would probably say Porco Rosso.
Now, if you asked me before I watched Porco Rosso, it would have been Lupin III, closely followed by Mononoke. It is a very close call. After having seen Porco Rosso recently, it might be that. I'd want to give it time before saying for sure, because again, I've only recently watched it, still fresh in my mind, but I just love that movie. I like how it almost feels like most of the people in the movie kind of seem to be aware they're in a movie, except for Porco Rosso himself, which kind of helps sells the idea that he doesn't feel like he belongs in this world anymore. Like he's almost an outsider to everything going on. I really like it. I think I'd have to agree with you. It's my favorite of his films. All right. That's it. I think we've covered just about everything.
In an exhaustive manner.
It's all right. We've had a few really short episodes by comparison. It's time for a fairly longer one, I guess. And because I think we keep forgetting to do this at the end of these shows, promoting our other stuff. I don't think we've actually done this once. So yeah, in the description of the video, we'll have links to all of Mildra's stuff. Talks about a variety of things, including tabletop RPGs, various other aspects of geek-like culture.
Mm-hmm.
You can follow me for any of my written reviews about video games, anime, the occasional other random thing I'll feel like talking about. And with that, I guess we'll see you next time on show 8's the next one?
Yep.
So we'll see you at some point at the beginning of next month.
And until then, stay frosty, folks.